changing the conditions and the environment in which our families live and thrive. People are in the core of every policy that we make.
This is exactly what we're trying to do in Russia, you know. We have a wide range of demographic policy tools to support families.
We live in a time where 30% of our people who are in reproductive age do not have children, and if the trend stays like this, they're not going to have children. Demographic issue is not the problem of one ministry. It is not even the problem only of the government. It is the problem of our society, so we all need to be included in this.
In fact, the first thing that is very important to understand is that there won't be any shortages of jobs.
When we talk about demography, there is constant discussion about the need to increase the birth rate and reverse the global trend. And here, an analogy comes to mind, and maybe, I don't know, maybe it's wrong, but an analogy comes to mind with global warming. It would seem that there are many things we could do, and it seems like humanity is doing a lot, but for some reason, the planet just keeps getting warmer and warmer. And this raises the question, do we even have the power to reverse these trends? There is this major demographic trend toward population decline, so all our initiatives will only delay it slightly. Can they change the trend? And most importantly, can they reverse this trend without interfering with people's freedom of choice? If a person has chosen that path, well, then that's what they've chosen. Let's talk about that now.
The Open Dialogue is an international project that brings together experts, analysts, and people from around the world to understand where humanity is heading. The second cycle of the project's report is dedicated to key megatrends that are already changing the world. The authors note the breakdown of the previous model of globalization, the transformation of the financial system, and rapid technological development. Demographic changes and new technologies are transforming labor markets, social institutions, and the very notion of sovereignty. In the new reality, human capital, the ability of a person to learn, adapt, and realize their potential, becomes the most important resource. But any forecast is not the final answer. This is an invitation to the open dialogue. Elena, if possible, let's start with you.
First of all, I would like to congratulate the authors of this report because I think they made a really good contribution to explaining one of the main challenges of the 21st century, which is a demographic decline. And I really appreciate the fact that they did not treat the demographic issue as a statistical issue, but as an issue that has influence on economics and politics and geopolitics and also the strategy of culture in our society. The report talks mostly about adapting to a demographic decline. And if we put adaptation as our core goal, then I think we are not aiming high enough. So adaptation is necessary, of course. We need to take care of the people that we have now, but I believe that demographic policy needs to be something more than this. It needs to, we have to broaden this concept to demographic resilience, which is based on two dimensions. One is adaptation, and this report talks about adaptation in lengths, but the other dimension is demographic renewal. And what I mean when I say demographic renewal, I mean we need to create conditions in which our people are willing to enter into relationships and to have families in which we can create future generations. Because I strongly believe that demographic policy is not only about managing the population that you have today, but also about creating conditions to have future generations. The other point that I wanted to make is regarding the sovereignty. So we are used to talking about sovereignty in terms of territory, population, government. And just now we have widened the concept of sovereignty to, we have heard here today, sovereignty in the terms of technology, energy, platforms, etc. And I think we need to talk more about demographic sovereignty. And what I mean by that is that the ability of a country or of a state to enable in a long term demographic renewal of its population, to help develop its human capital and to keep its social cohesion. And we can do all this by changing the conditions and the environment in which our families live and thrive. Because I believe that people are in the core of every policy that we make. And the third point that I wanted to make is regarding the human capital. This report talks about human capital in the sense of quality of human capital, which is, of course, essential. We need to talk about and work on the skills of our human capital, of our population, their health, education, etc. but it does not talk about the quantity of human capital. And I think we really need to talk about this and why we need to. It's not just the phrase like the quality comes from the quantity. It's not that. It's that now we live in a time where the life is prolonged. So we have a situation where we have more generations living at the same time, but we have less and less people within each generation. And what does this mean is that we have the verticalization of the family, verticalization of the family relations. So the network, the social network that family used to be, is growing smaller and smaller. And then it's going to be on the state to support the weakest members of our society, because family support is not going to be there. And the other thing is that less people in each generation means less cousins, less people you can connect to, less people who can transfer the knowledge and experience and traditions and values. So these are the three main issues that I think we need to focus when we talk about this report.
In response to what has been said, I truly believe, and I agree with this point of view, that demographic policy and demographic issues are currently receiving far too little attention around the world. This is actually one of the key issues that affects many areas of our lives and has a profound impact on what our future will look like. And we see examples of countries that make certain decisions impacting their demographic situation, or conversely, those that do nothing and subsequently fall into a trap from which it is difficult to escape. Let's take a look at East Asia. Japan and South Korea, countries that have long been grappling with low birth rates and at the same time a lack of significant immigration, are seeing cities and schools emptying out, experiencing a heavy burden on their pension systems, and so on. It's a whole complex of problems that these countries, in fact, don't know how to deal with. And the problems there just keep getting worse and worse and worse, while in the early stages the decline in the birth rate was offset by an increase in life expectancy. The same trend of declining birth rates is now becoming so pronounced that this is no longer the case. This leads to serious economic and social problems. You're right about the point regarding, for example, the verticalization of families. This has a very significant impact on the social climate and society, on the social history, and so on. There are examples of countries within the European Union itself where the problem of low birth rates is being addressed through immigration. We are now seeing recent studies that clearly demonstrate that the economic impact of a migrant arriving in country is often negative. In other words, the migrants' contribution to the economy is much smaller than the burden they place on the social sector and the problems associated with a massive influx of migrants. Again, decisions made in the past, perhaps unconsciously in some cases, are leading to very serious long-term consequences. And I really like the idea of demographic sovereignty. It's a concept that we need to discuss, think about, define more preciously, and that should lead to an active demographic policy. Here in Russia, we're trying to do this, as you know, using the wide range of demographic policy measures to support families. Given the challenging budgetary situation, demographic and social policy remains a priority here. But the problem is so widespread, so serious, and it's not just a financial issue. It's also a question of how society as a whole lives and how it views this issue. Why are we now seeing both Australia and certain European Union countries banning social media for children? This is also an effect related to its impact on social behavior, demography, and so on. We see a major problem, one of the main reasons why birth rates are falling sharply, which is decline in the number of couples forming as people reach adulthood. We can see that the number of single people is rising dramatically, and while loneliness may be tolerated more or less well in certain situations, in the long run it is, of course, a very negative factor. Therefore, what the whole world really needs to be talking about, given that the Open Dialogue prepared this report and highlighted this as one of the key issues, that the whole world really needs to be talking about the demographic sovereignty, what this concept entails, and what measures should be taken to ensure it. I completely agree with you on this. I really like your idea.
Thank you, Matt. I would also like to comment with some demographic statistics that I think are very important, because this is something that people tend to remember and this tends to make an effect. The statistics that I'm talking about are from Serbia, but they apply to the most of the developed world because the situation is similar. So we live in a time where 30% of our people who are in reproductive age do not have children. And if the trend stays like this, they're not going to have children. As you mentioned before, somebody here mentioned the free will. It is a private choice and a free will if we are going to have kids and how many kids are we going to have. But if we arrive to a situation that we are in today, where 30% of our population came to the situation where they don't have children, whether they wanted or not, but they came to the situation where they don't have children. So the sum of these individual decisions is having a cumulative effect on the whole society. So this is something that we need to deal as a society. I said the demographic issue is not the problem of one ministry. It is not even the problem only of the government. It is the problem of our society. So we all need to be included in this, from high schools or primary schools where we can teach children about relationships, about communication, from universities, from, of course, local communities and cultural stage of our country also. I mean, there is so many ways in which we can influence in order to bring back the family and the traditional values to the stage, to give them back the prestige they need to have.
That's absolutely right. Only a comprehensive approach can solve this complex problem in every area. In other words, if something is overlooked somewhere, it can undermine the entire result. That's absolutely true. And second, and last point I'd like to emphasize is that it's very important to understand that people, especially in the West, think it's okay now to have children. I'll save up, I'll have financial assets, and that will provide for me when I'm old. In reality, however, even a pension system based on the accumulation of financial assets, if there is no younger generation, those financial assets will be worthless, because consumption is always sustained by those who work. If you don't have a younger generation, then all your financial assets, your real estate investments and so on will lose their value. We can already see from the example I mentioned, South Korea, that entire towns are being abandoned, and if you are invested in real estate there, that property is now worth nothing. If China's urban population falls from 900 million today to 500 million or 450 million by the end of this century, that means real estate in half of China's city will be worth nothing. No one will want it. And financial assets related to these instruments or other instruments will also be impaired. That is why the future must always be built on the younger generations. If your country lacks a younger generation, it has no future.
As always, we have a question from one of our essayists, this time from Polina Anufrieva. Polina, please.
I found the report really interesting, but what struck me the most are 2 points that, in my view, contradict each other. On the one hand, according to forecasts, 620 million people in Africa will enter the labour market by 2050, and they will certainly need jobs. But at the same time, automation and artificial intelligence are eliminating millions of jobs, and the report proposes retraining current and future potential employees. But in my opinion, this is still like treating the symptoms rather than the disease. Because what's the point in creating jobs that will eventually be replaced by machines anyway? And this raises the question, perhaps we should move away from the traditional concept of job creation towards simply providing people with social guarantees, regardless of their form of employment. What needs to be done? Where should we start? Perhaps with reforms, such as tax reform or a reform of the social security system? Or, more generally, what do we need to do now rather than in 10 years?
Now that we've gone deeper into the technological aspect, the first thing that's very important to understand is there will not be any shortages of jobs. This isn't a matter for microeconomics or technology policy, it's a matter for macroeconomics. If you have a place to deploy the labor force, then macroeconomics tools can always be used to create additional demand, which will in turn generate these jobs. Therefore, the issue here is no longer the total number of jobs, but rather a shift in their structure. That is, so to speak, the first point. Your second point is that everyone who participates in the economy should be guaranteed certain social rights. That is absolutely correct, and I fully support this argument. But it is important to understand that if certain jobs generate added value that makes it possible to fund social guarantees and a high level of income, and new investments, that is one situation. If jobs are created in sectors where added value is not very high, this generally reduces the economic's efficiency, and therefore such employment tends to have a negative rather than a positive effect. Therefore, first and foremost, we need to strive to ensure that unemployment, and here in Russia we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world, if not the lowest among major countries. We need to ensure it remains low, so that there is always an opportunity to find employment, and that is employment is well paid, which means this job, in conjunction with technological solutions, must generate corresponding added value, and we must ensure that these jobs are directed precisely toward those sectors where the resulting added value is greater. If a particular sector does not generate such high added value, it means that the pricing structure in the economy is not functioning properly. Freelancers' work, their services, if there is no such added value, are paid less than they should be, and the cost of these services needs to be higher so that all added value is factored into support, among other things, the social sector, which is why it is now very important for us to reform, as you correctly point out, both tax legislation and regulatory frameworks. In general, the issue of platform-based employment is becoming very important. The issue of protecting people who work on platforms, that is the social security system for this group, and the protection of workers' rights, that also needs to change. It must adapt to the new economic realities, that is, not working for a company anymore, but rather doing temporary jobs on various platforms. But the issue is designing a system so that economic incentives aren't distorted. After all, this is what it looks like. You start a business, stop paying taxes, and suddenly you have a highly efficient business. You can hire new employees, and you say, "I'm doing well, I've hired new employees." But if your business can't afford to pay taxes, that means it's creating very little added value. And by creating new jobs in your business, you're actually lowering, not raising, the economy's efficiency and people's standard or living overall. That is why these economic distortions should not occur. But returning to the topic of demography we're discussing now, you mentioned the figure of garden, the new generation, the new workforce that is currently emerging in Africa. For humanity as a whole, unlocking Africa's potential, ensuring that these people receive the necessary level of education, that the necessary infrastructure is in place so that they have access to technological innovations, and so on, this is really something which the future of humanity largely depends on, because this is precisely the generation that will shape what the planet's population will look like in 50 to 100 years. However, returning to the issue of demographic sovereignty, we must always ask ourselves, if the younger generation remains there, if it is educated, if infrastructure is built there, and if there is economic activity, then why would that generation need other generations in the rest of the world? Africa will have to deal with this problem, while an aging South Korea will be left to its own devices. And so the question is, what exactly is so dangerous about demography? You're looking at the average figures across the globe. Overall, things look pretty good on average, but this is the average temperature for the entire hospital. Different countries, different regions of the world, demographic trends and patterns are such more pronounced there. And the idea that the younger generation in African countries will support the older generation in East Asia is very questionable. Even if you accumulate financial assets now and make investments on the African continent, there is no guarantee that those investments will generate a return for you later on. All of this is happening in the financial markets and in relations between countries, which is why demographic sovereignty, a term I really like, is a key issue that should form one of the cornerstones of public policy.
I want to go back to the question regarding the job market and if we are going to need people. I think this is a question that was raised with every technological revolution. Every technological revolution brought the same insecurities about job market. And what happened is that new jobs were created, new types of jobs were created. Just look like 20 or 30 years ago. I'm sure that my parents never heard for jobs such as app creator or cloud architect or social networks manager or something like that. I have 5 children. I believe that they are going to work in some jobs that I cannot imagine now. So coming back to demographic issue, I think that countries such as ours that are dealing with demographic decline do not have a problem of too many people in the workforce. We have a survival problem. We need to go back to the original idea of putting humans in the center of our politics.
That's absolutely right. For some reason, people are constantly afraid that there won't be enough work. Indeed, the issue at stake is very survival of humanity, the survival of individual countries, individual societies, and individual communities. And to reiterate, I believe that discussing this matter and developing solutions through the concept of demographic sovereignty is entirely justified and absolutely correct.
Thank you very much. If possible, very quickly. It's just that there have been so many questions on this very topic. It's as if we've been talking all day about labour productivity, which, by definition, isn't really about increasing the number of people. Yet, on the other hand, we're saying that we need more people. Is this a false dichotomy?
Yes, it's a completely false dichotomy because...
So, can we do either?
Yes, an increase in the number of people, or at the very least maintaining the current number, does not mean a decline in the quality of life. Labor productivity is about the efficiency of economic activity and the level of prosperity and the well-being of society as a whole, and the two are by no means contradictory.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with this. We need to work on raising the quality of our human capital, but also think about the quantity of the human capital.
It will become increasingly difficult to maintain quality as the quantity decreases.
Is it simply because of the sample size?
No, it's just the number of problems that will arise from a slight decline in the working-age population and so on will divert human resources away from solving new problems as they arise. This means that it will become increasingly difficult to ensure quality of life in this regard.
Well, you're not just a techno-optimist, you're an optimist in general. And it seems to me that all of us here in the open dialogue are more or less optimists.
Just one more thing that I think we need to add here. It's that more young people means more positive energy in society and more creativity. And I was just talking to some of your colleagues yesterday here from the National Center Russia. I mean, it is quite obvious that a lot of young people are working here because the energy and the efficiency is totally different when you enter here and when you enter into some institutions where more older people are doing. So younger people bring more positivity, more creativity, more dynamism to society as a whole.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That's exactly what we're talking about, the social effects. They're just as important as the purely quantitative effects. In other words, the changes here are fundamental and profound. Yes, that's true.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.